All of you this morning. Tomorrow is Labor Day. All of you look kind of sleepy today. I don't know what that's about, but I guess you're anticipating everything that's going to happen tomorrow, or anticipating staying up late tonight, or doing something else, going camping tomorrow or something. According to the U.S. Today, there's a firm that spent billions of dollars, and they spent billions of dollars taking polls on trying to fire up employees and trying to make employees excited about their work. And they determined that 55% of people in general have no enthusiasm and no excitement about the place that they work. It's 55%. That's a pretty high percentage, isn't it? In fact, they found out that around 19% of people, that the corporation or the companies would be better off if they didn't even show up for work. Around 19% of the people, that their attitudes were so negative, or their attitudes were so distasteful, or they had such a negative view of how their job was functioning, that around 19% of people, it would be better if they just didn't show up to work. And there are a lot of people in general, and you can think through this as well, who simply, they don't like their job, they don't like the situation they find themselves in. And you may be there this morning. You may think to yourself, my job's really terrible. I don't like the place that I work. I don't like the people that I work with. I don't like the job that I have in general. And so how do you function in that type of atmosphere? How do you function in a place that you don't like? You know, you can think about the negative things at work. It could be a disgruntled employee, or an overbearing boss, or unresolved conflict, low pay, the possibility of layoffs, no health insurance, and these things sort of stack up. And this morning we're going to talk about honoring God with our attitude toward work. Honoring God with our attitude toward work, regardless of how you view your job, regardless if you like it or you don't. At some point in life, you're probably going to have a job that you don't like. Now, at some point in life, you may have retired from a job that you didn't like. And for your entire career, you may have had a job that you didn't like as well. But regardless if you like the job or you don't like the job, regardless if you like the place that you work or you don't like the place you work, here's the idea that you honor God with your attitude. Colossians chapter 3 says, a famous passage on what it means to work in general. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord, not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done. There's no partiality. So whatever you do, regardless of where you work as to the Lord. When we think about why we don't like the place that we work, why that we don't like the job that's been given to us, generally it hovers around at least four or so ideas. First of all, we may not like the job because I have a lack of chemistry. These all start with C's, but a lack of chemistry between us and the employer, or between us and fellow workers. And so you just don't get along. The reason that you don't like the place that you work is because you don't get along with anybody else who is there. And that can be a very difficult situation. Other people, you don't like the job not because of chemistry, but you don't like the job because of your calling. You think to yourself, this isn't where I'm supposed to be. This isn't what God has called me to do with my life. This isn't where God has called me to work. And so I'm simply doing a job that I don't want to do. I'm performing a task, and I know I need to make money. I know I need to pay the bills, but this isn't the job that I want. For other people, another C is a lack of conviction. You don't have conviction for the place that you're working. You don't agree with the ethics involved behind the scenes. You don't believe in what's going on in general. You don't believe in how those things are working out. And so maybe your boss or someone else in the organization simply doesn't have the right type of ethics, or the right type of ideas as well. And so there's a lack of conviction. And the other thing would be a lack of competency. You don't know how to do your job, or that happens sometimes. You're thrown into a situation that you don't know what to do. I've been a pastor for 15 or 16 years, and I'm convinced every day I'm not even sure I know what I'm doing. You're looking at me right now. You're like, obviously you don't know what you're doing, because you barely paying attention to me. You're thinking this guy doesn't know what he's talking about or what he's doing in general. And so there can be a lack of competency. You don't know what you're doing with the job. And these can create sort of a breach or frustrations and difficulties in the place that we work. But regardless of that, here's the idea. Regardless if there's a lack of chemistry, you don't get along with anybody, regardless if there's a lack of calling, you're thinking, this isn't the job that I want to do. lack of competency. I don't know how to do the job. Well, try to figure it out. Or there's a lack of conviction. This isn't the right type of situation. You know, regardless of all those, you still have an attitude that honors God, an attitude that focuses on what God is doing. And you realize that this focus begins with the idea that the purpose of work is to glorify God. It says, whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord. In Genesis chapter 2, in verse 2, it says, by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, God rested. God had been working. God had been performing some task. And we forget sometimes that there is the work of God. We call the created universe the work of God. And so work itself, or the idea of work, is actually, it's rooted in theology. It's rooted in our belief in God. That's kind of hard to think through, isn't it? To think to yourself that God created us to work. God didn't just create us for rest, but God created us to work. Now, if sin and death and destruction, if all of that hadn't entered into the world, maybe work would look a lot different. Maybe work would be more focused on what we're excited to do, or more focused on stuff that's artistic, or stuff that's creative, or ways that we like to engage the world around us. But instead, work can be frustrating, and work can be very difficult, and work can be very hard. But to remember that God created everything, and so there's this divine purpose that God has in making the universe. There's this divine purpose that God has in the place that you work as well, and God has you there for a reason. That's hard to remember. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says that I become all things to all people. I know that I'm in a situation that I'm in because I'm becoming all things to all people. In the book of Philippians, the Apostle Paul, he's actually in prison. He's in a Roman prison, and he doesn't complain. He doesn't become bitter about the situation. Instead, he says this. He says, I believe that God has me here for a purpose of spreading the good news of Jesus Christ. God has me in this particular circumstance for his purpose of bringing other people to know Jesus. And there's this sense in which we realize that if our goal in work is to glorify God, if our goal in work is to honor God, then God has placed us in specific circumstances or specific situations in order to do just exactly that, to glorify or to honor him. When I was a teenager in high school, one of my first jobs was as a convenience station. And it seemed like everyone there, this was when I was probably 16, 17 years old. I knew the Lord had called me in the ministry then. I was already preaching and speaking at different churches, and I wanted to be a pastor. I would have pastored a church at 16 years old if someone had said, why don't you come and be our pastor? But that didn't happen, and so I continued working at a convenience store, and it seemed like everyone there was focused on other things than obviously God. They were focused on partying. They were focused on things that would detract them from the things of God. They were focused on life in general. And I remember thinking to myself, why does God have me right here when I could be doing something different? And over time, I realized the reason that God had me there in a situation that I didn't like, around people that I didn't really want to be around. You know, you may think that. I don't really want to be around these people. The reason God had me there is to be a witness for his kingdom. It was to tell other people about Christ. It was to show that the word of the Lord can work through us regardless of those type of situations as well. And often we need to take a step back and realize that God has placed us in a specific location for the reasons of glorifying him. Paul was in prison. How many of you want to be in prison? Prison wasn't like prison then, wasn't like prison is now. In prison, you had to have people bring you food or you didn't eat. There was no heat, there was no air, there was no conveniences. It was a very inconvenient situation. And for some of you, your job right now, it's a very inconvenient situation. It's a place that you don't like. And again, Paul doesn't complain, he doesn't murmur, he doesn't grumble about what's going on. Instead, he says, God has me here for a reason. God has me here for a purpose. And that's a divine calling. That's a word from the Lord. It doesn't matter how the events change. It doesn't matter what's going on. God has you here for a reason. God has you here for a purpose as well. One of the most fascinating stories that I have read was about a surgical assistant, a surgeon's right-hand man, who was looking for a new job, and they could not stand where they were working. And according to an article written in prayer magazine, a door, an opportunity opened up for this person to work in the field of plastic surgery. Now, that's typically a field that doesn't involve very many believers, very many Christians as well. The author was saying, who wrote this article by the name of Brandon Bradley, that it's typically filled with vanity and it's filled with things that maybe aren't from the Lord. But they were placed in this situation to work, and they thought to themselves, well, how am I going to honor God in a place that's filled with vanity? And so they began to tell their employees, before work, I'm going to be here in this room and I'm going to pray. And so they were there every morning. They began to pray. And that prayer ministry grew and grew until more people circled around them. And finally, 10 or so people had come to know Christ in the middle of this situation. And as Brandon Bradley wrote this, he said, I didn't understand why God had placed me here. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew I could do a couple of things. I knew I could pray to God, and I knew I could talk to other people about Jesus, and I knew God, of course, had placed me here for a specific reason. And because he saw God placing him there for a reason, it began to be like a light that was attracting other people around him. And that's what God is saying through Paul. Paul is in prison. I don't know why God's placed me here. I don't know what God is doing. But God has me here for his reason, to be a witness for him. So there's this idea that work, it's rooted in God and glorifying God as well. So how do you honor God with your attitude toward work? Realize that it's rooted in who God is, that God has placed you here for a reason. Also, you realize that your work ethics in general, they're based upon God's word, and they're based upon how you view who God is. Whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart as working for the Lord, not for people. You'll receive your inheritance. Your work isn't for people. Your work isn't just to please people. Your work isn't just to please the boss. You may think, I can't please the boss. I have no way to please the boss. The boss doesn't even like me. Well, God likes you, so you have that going for you. But still, there's this idea, regardless if the boss likes you or doesn't like you, I'm here because I want to please God. So here's a calling. I want to please the Lord. You can tell, can't you tell this? You can tell if people like their job or they don't. Isn't that pretty obvious generally? When you're checking out of the grocery store, you can tell if somebody likes their job or they don't like their job. When you're at a restaurant and you're being waited on, you can tell if somebody likes their job or they don't like their job. If you're getting your car fixed, you can tell if somebody likes their job or they don't like their job. When you're listening to the preacher, you can tell if somebody likes their job or they don't like their job. Those things generally come out if they like it or they don't like it, if they're just here, if they're just occupying space, or they're just existing, or if it's another job. When my boys were smaller, I think it was my oldest son, Blaze, I was taking him to kindergarten, and it was the drop-off line, and there was this traffic assistant, and this guy loved his job. I remember every morning I wanted to pass him because it was a reminder that regardless of what you're doing, you do it as to the Lord, and you need to love what you're doing. But this guy, he was directing traffic. And this was like Mozart directing an orchestra, the way that he directed traffic. I mean, I don't even know if I can do it, but it was like he moved this way, and it was just very clean. I mean, he was like dancing. It was like watching a ballet movement, watching him direct traffic. And I remember driving by him every day. I thought to myself, this guy absolutely loves his job. And don't you like to see that? People who absolutely love his job. Now, the moment, or the thought also entered into my mind, what if he doesn't like his job, but he's thinking to himself, I'm going to act like I like my job? Or what if he didn't like his job, but he thought to himself, I saw these cool dance moves on TV, and I'm going to try them while I'm directing traffic. Well, whatever the case, he was fooling all of us because it looked like he was really passionate about what he was doing, and he really enjoyed what he was doing. And regardless of where you are right now, the idea is you're working as to the Lord. And if God himself were at your place of work, which he is right now, and he were saying to you, why don't you do this unto me? Why don't you work as you would work for me? Well, you would probably pep up the pace a little bit, wouldn't you? You might put a smile on your face. You might act a little bit nicer. You might look like you like it, regardless if you don't, because God says, do this as unto me, as unto the Lord. And so there's this idea. Our concentration, it's shifted from the boss, it's shifted from the vocation, it's shifted from the employer, It's shifted from other people's opinions to the Lord's supervision. He's the one who is directing our path. He is the King of Kings. He is the Lord of Lords. And you think to yourself, well, my employer doesn't like the way I work. Other people around me don't like the way I work. And I've said this before, but if the king approves the servant, who cares about what the court gestures say? If the king approves the servant, who's the king? That's God. If God approves what you're doing, who cares what anybody else says about what you're doing? You have to stand before God. You have to honor God with what you do in your life. As whatever you do, work with all of your heart as unto the Lord. Now, there's also can be vanity in thinking that we have the most significant job ever. That this is unto the Lord, but there's not humility in that. That our work it's the greatest work ever. And I never wanted to get to the point where I think that what I do is the greatest thing ever. And sometimes you get to that point because you like what you do. But you think this is the greatest thing that can be accomplished. One of my favorite stories is this story. It's in a small village, and there are these people walking down on the sidewalk, and someone sets out a chalkboard. And you may have heard this before, but on the chalkboard there's a priest who walks by, and he writes down on the chalkboard, "I am the priest, I pray for all of you." And he thinks this is going to be a really grand statement. Along comes a lawyer, and he walks by the chalkboard, and he thinks that he can add to it. And he says, "I am a lawyer, I defend all of you." It was significant. Doctor walks by next, and he sees the chalkboard, what the priest has written and what the lawyer has written. The doctor picks up the chalk, and he says, "I am the doctor, I cure all of you." And finally, a normal, average employee walks by, and he picks up the chalk, and he looks at all of these people's statements, and he says, "I am the average employee. I pay for all of you." You know, that's a pretty profound statement, isn't it? That here's the average person. Sometimes we down jobs, and we don't think, well, this job has significance, and this way that God has created us. It's the way that He makes everything work. God needs all of us. Just as God needs all of us to accomplish His will in this church, God needs all of us in the broader sense in the world to accomplish His work around the world. It takes every type of person in the Lord working through all of us. And so our vocation, our calling, it's selected in a way that's accomplishing God's kingdom mission. Now, you may not be in the place that you want to be. You may think to yourself, this is not where I intended to be. This is not where I wanted to be in life. You may be exactly where you don't want to be, and I'm reminded often of Joseph. Whenever I consider the fact, I may not be where I want to be, or you may not be where you want to be, you always need to remember Joseph. Nothing was going for Joseph. Joseph was exactly where he didn't want to be. He was cast out. He was thrown aside, and God worked out these events to bring him to the house of Pharaoh. And while others were demoting Joseph, God was promoting Joseph. It didn't look like that originally, did it? It looked like this guy's got a serious demotion, that he's going to be cast out. But God was moving, and God was changing the situation. God was bringing Joseph to where God wanted Joseph to be. And so some of you may be in college, or you may have a starter job. You may not have the job that you want, and you're like, where am I at right now? Well, God may be moving the pieces, and God may be bringing you into the situation that He wants to bring you into. There may be someone right now that you're working with who has a contact with someone else that's going to ultimately get you to where God wants you to be. I don't know if you think about those things, but God is able to move all of those pieces. God is able to make all of that function according to His will. In Genesis chapter 50 it says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me.'" These are his brothers. They tried to kill him. "But God intended it for the good, to accomplish what is being done, the saving of many lives." Your employer, you think to him or yourself, he or she, they planned to harm me. They planned to tear me down. But God used it for the good. The people who are coming to sue, they planned to tear me down. They planned to tear me apart. But God used it for the good. God used it for the good of others. And God used it for the good of me as well. And there's this sense, this profound sense of the divine nature of God, that when we're walking in the will of God, God is the one who is standing behind us. God is the one who is standing beside us. And regardless of what we're facing, God has our back. Someone may have spread false rumors about you at work. God's the one who has your back. Someone may have really degraded your work ethic or made you look wrong in the light of maybe of your employer. God's the one who has your back, and you need to stop worrying about that and just focus again on pleasing the Lord. I was at the playground yesterday, out on South County Cape Park, the new playground, and Knox and Ames were with me. That's my 7-year-old and my 4-year-old. They were with me, and so we're playing on the playground, and these little boys walk up to Ames, my 4-year-old, and they look at him, and I'm kind of at a distance of what's going on, but they're saying to Ames, they're saying, we're going to beat you up. Now, that's a good situation to be in, isn't it? I've never been there before, but they're saying, we're going to beat you up. We're going to, we're going to take you down. And Knox walked up, and some of you have seen Knox. Knox is a pretty big boy. And these kids were probably 5 or 6 years old. And Knox said to them, why don't you beat me up first? Why don't you come through me and beat me up first? And those boys, they took off running. If I had been 6 or 7 or 14 years old and I saw Knox, I might have taken off running as well. But they took off running. And that's how God has our back. The employer comes at you. The job situation comes at you. The critics come at you. The hostility comes at you. You need to realize that our God is our Father, and He is the one who's watching over us. He's stronger than any obstacle. He's larger than any difficulty we're going to face. He's bigger than the circumstances you feel are tearing you down right now. So whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord. Proverbs 16 verse 9 says, in his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps. It's God who determines what's going on. We plan our course. We think a lot of ways about how we're going to accomplish things in the future. We think about all the doors that we can open. We think about all the ways that we can accomplish what we're going to accomplish. In his heart, a man, we plan our course. But the Lord is the one who determines our steps. The Lord is the one who takes us to the place that we're going to be ultimately. And so regardless of the pressure that's going on, God is your strength. In fact, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13 says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Now, sometimes we read that verse and we think to ourselves, regardless of what I want to do, it means that God's going to give me strength. Well, that's not the case. You can look at the future. I could say to myself, right now, I'm going to quit ministry because I want to be a linebacker in the NFL. Sounds good, doesn't it? That sounds wonderful on paper, doesn't it? And, I can quote and I can say, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. I can get to the coach and say, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And finally, when I get to the NFL and I'm standing before a coach and I say, hey, hold on, guy, you don't know. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. He will probably say, that sounds really great, but you're not going to make the cut. You're not going to make it. This isn't what you were built for. This isn't what you were made for. And so what's Paul talking about there? Paul is saying that regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the situation, regardless of what occurs, you can endure it because God is the one who has given you strength. Because God is the one who is making you strong. It may not be the place that you want to be. May not be the job that you want to have. May not be the situation that you want to endure. But regardless of where you are, you can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. They did an interview of some individuals of what really scares them about work. We think of work and being scared of work and contrasting that with fear. And so they interviewed some people in human resources management. They took this survey of what troubles employees the most. 19% was losing their job. 13% was actually the company going out of business. 12% was losing their retirement. 10% was health insurance coverage. Physical security at work was 9%, and the company relocating was 4%. All of those deal with the unknown. How am I going to face the future? How am I going to deal with circumstances that I cannot control? Isn't that life in general, though? How am I going to deal with it when I can't afford as much as I used to afford? How am I going to deal with it when I retire? How am I going to deal with it if my health deteriorates and I can't have the same type of job performance? All this is fear. And it's fear without realizing that we can do all things through Christ who gives us strength. We can endure all circumstances because God is the one who is making us strong, because God is the one who is making us complete. And ultimately, we realize, as Ephesians 2 verse 10 says, we are God's workmanship created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. That's a big verse, isn't it? You're God's workmanship. The Greek word there is the word for poem or the word for a composition. You're something that God has put together. You're performing the work of God. You're performing the will of God. And this is something God prepared for you to do in advance. Prepared for you to do beforehand. So God has already ordained your steps. God is already unfolding the future. God already knows what's going on. And God has prepared you for this work. So you think to yourself, well, I have a terrible job, or I don't like the situation I'm in. I don't like my circumstances. You need to look up, because God is the one who's given you strength. God is the one who has prepared you for the destiny that he has called you to. And regardless if you see it right now, he's going to get you to where you want to be and where he wants you to be as well. Would you stand with me this morning? Father, in these final moments, Lord, as we think about the work of the Lord,